So many people hate on poor Thomas Boleyn because of his representation in the Tudors, but this is not the real guy, and he was not the villain. So who really was Thomas Boleyn? First of all, this is the real guy, and of course he is the father of Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn, as well as Mary Boleyn and George Boleyn. He is the grandfather of Elizabeth I. And though he's often portrayed as the father who dangled both his daughters in front of the king and then pushed Anne Boleyn to rise to power and then abandoned her at the last minute before execution, this is not actually true. And modern day dramas that have developed a certain image of Thomas Boleyn, they need to be put aside so that the truth can emerge. So Thomas Boleyn was born in 1477 in Norfolk, and he inherited Hever Castle from his father. Thomas was an ambitious man, and he was a courtier in the reign of Henry VII. And he was one of the men that Henry VII sent with a small force to put down the pretender Perkin Warbeck. In 1501, he attended the marriage of Arthur Tudor with Catherine of Aragon. And in 1503, he was one of the escorts that led Princess Margaret Tudor to Scotland when she married the King of Scotland, James IV. Thomas went on to marry Elizabeth Howard, and they had 4 children. But of course, we only know the 3 that survived to adulthood, which is Mary Boleyn, Anne Boleyn, and George Boleyn. And it is recorded that he was a very loving and attentive father, which is rather uncommon in those days. But he did have high hopes for his children too, and he got them a really good education, even for his daughters, which again is not that common. He wanted them to do well in the world. And slowly but surely he did make an impression in Henry VIII's court, and in 1512 he was made the English ambassador in the Netherlands. This is where he made some very important connections, and soon he secured positions for both his daughters to attend the Princess Mary Tudor when she went off to France to marry the old King Louis XII. And while the 2 daughters remained in France even when Mary Tudor returned to England, Thomas continued to faithfully serve the king within the court. And in 1518 he was made ambassador to France, helping to arrange the Field of Cloth of Gold, for instance, which is a big deal. As we know, Henry VIII went on to have an affair with Mary Boleyn, but when he set his sights on Anne and she refused, there wasn't much that anyone could do, because in those days, people didn't say no to the king. And though Thomas had some influence at the court by this point, he couldn't really tell the king to not pursue his daughter. As we know, instead, Anne fled the court and went back to Hever Castle. But other than that, there wasn't really much else that the Boleyn family could do when the king wanted Anne. As we know, he continued to harass her and send her letters and gifts which she returned, and it was all a big hoopla. But remember that a woman's virtue is directly linked with a family's honour, so I really do not think for a moment that Thomas Boleyn would have been pushing Anne on the king if she didn't want to be with him. Mary Boleyn was already tainted by her affair with the king and was known as the Great Prostitute, so I don't think Thomas Boleyn would have wanted both his daughters, who he loved very much, to be painted with that same brush. And of course, when it all went down with the Anne Boleyn scandal, and then when George was executed and Anne was awaiting her execution, Thomas Boleyn remained silent, and his silence is really what sealed his fate as a villain. But again, we need to remember that Thomas Boleyn, or anyone, could do very little to save Anne Boleyn. Let's not forget that he had another child to think of, Mary. He was already losing 2 of his children and had another to consider. If he'd opened his mouth and made a big song and dance about the other 2, he likely would have lost his head, as well as potentially dragged Mary into it. And after Anne's execution, Thomas Boleyn was actually allowed to return to court, which suggests that the king did value his services. But ultimately, broken-hearted, he died just 3 years later. And although we'll probably never really know the 100% truth, we must remember that Thomas Boleyn was just one small piece of this massive puzzle. And since history is often written by the victors, it's not surprising that his family name would be dragged through the mud after Anne's execution.